A PechaKucha presentation from each of 4 master teachers. I call them master teachers because each one of them have been recognized by the Quality and Instruction Council for excellence in teaching here at DePaul. They represent a very diverse group of women from lots of diverse fields. We have from law, music education, English, and public health. 4 very different fields, all with they want to share with you, hopefully giving each of you to your own instruction, your own teaching. Our first presentation today is going to be by Emily Cauble, who's from the College of Law. She joined DePaul University College of Law in 2012 after teaching at Michigan State University College of Law and as a visiting assistant professor at the University of Illinois College of Law. Her research focuses on tax policy, business tax, and tax planning. At DePaul, she has taught federal income tax and policy, international taxation, corporate taxation, and a tax policy seminar, along with the first-year course in contracts. She is a graduate from the University of Notre Dame and from the University of Michigan Law School. After graduating from law school, she practiced in tax transactions group at Mayer Brown in Chicago. Prior to attending law school, she worked as a research assistant at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C. And she is, I can say, one of our best professors. Please welcome Emily Cauble.
All right, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I selected as the theme for my presentation assessment and feedback in large classes. And to put things in perspective, in the law school, a large class is about 80 students, which might seem small for some of you who are in other areas. What I will talk about is a variety of different techniques that I use, and generally during the semester I'll use some of all of them, but you could kind of recalibrate and use different amounts of different techniques because some are more time intensive and some are less time intensive. And I wanted to say at the outset, I find it kind of ludicrous to be on a panel titled Masters in Teaching. I by no means have all the answers. I'm hoping to learn from my fellow panelists and all of you, and I'm sure I will. And I look forward to comments and suggestions that any of you have in our comments afterwards, question session afterwards about techniques that you use. So as I said, I'll talk about a mixture of different options during any given semester. I usually use each of these at least one time. They vary based on the amount of time involved on the instructor's behalf, and also based on the degree to which you're giving students individualized feedback. One option that I use is to have students complete individual exercises, but instead of giving them individual feedback, I give feedback to the class as a whole. Usually what we will do is walk through a problem step by step, and I'll solicit volunteers or call on people, call on students to walk through the problems kind of one step at a time, and I'll rely on them to self-assess, to gauge whether or not their answer is similar to the model answer that we kind of create as a class. But in addition to providing a model answer, I'll also give them examples of common pitfalls. And I usually don't pull these from actual wrong answers that students themselves created. I kind of put together my own common pitfalls, and we discuss why those answers were wrong, because sometimes I think if they look just at the model answer, they might not be able to identify that their answer is importantly different from the model answer, but if they see a common pitfall and understand why that is wrong, it might flag an issue for them that they wouldn't have otherwise seen. Another option is to basically do the same thing, but have them assess each other's work, which is something that I also do from time to time. And a third option is to have them work in groups of about 3 to 5, do an exercise, turn it in, and then instead of giving feedback to the class as a whole, I'll provide individual feedback. And when I'm providing the individual feedback, I'll usually have them turn it in Word. I will use the red line feature to make stylistic type comments in their actual writing, and then I'll use the comment feature in Word to make some more substantive type comments. And I find that, it's certainly time intensive, but there are also, students tend to make the same mistakes repeatedly, and so you can kind of automate this to some extent. You'll find that you're making the same substantive comments, usually not just on one student's answer, but on more than one. And I also, when I'm doing this, provide a model answer and a document describing common pitfalls and why they were wrong, because I think even if a student hasn't made the particular mistake, they might have just lucked out, and so it's still useful for them to see a description of answers that were wrong and why they were wrong. And then the fourth option, which is sort of the most time intensive but also gives the most individual feedback, is to do basically the same thing but have each student turn in their own work, which I try to do at least once during the semester, besides the final exam, which of course they're always doing on their own, and depending on the class size, ideally more than once. And then a fifth option is multiple choice, which they can all do individually and get individual response, individual feedback in that way. Of course, the key, like with any multiple choice question, is that some topics lend themselves more to multiple choice questions than others, and being able to pick sort of the right wrong answers is key. Basically, the idea is to sort of translate what would be a common pitfall into a multiple choice response to have as an option. And then in the process of giving them feedback, to go over not just which answer was right, but also which answers were wrong and why. Other possibilities, using teaching assistants is something that I have not done, because in the law school I would be using someone who would just be a year or two ahead of the student in the same program of study, but would maybe be more feasible at the undergraduate level if you had graduate teaching assistants. And then, how do I use the information that I get through giving feedback? At the beginning of each class, I spend some time recapping the previous class, and if I have had them do some sort of assessment related to the material covered in the previous class, it makes clear to me areas that they found confusing that I can give more emphasis to when I'm recapping the material from the previous class. I also, in addition to making suggestions about how they should improve their work, I can point them to, here are the particular modules that we covered that you seem to struggle with that you should go back and look at again. And then, of course, it helps with planning for the next term. That's, I will stop there, and look forward to any questions and comments after.
I should clarify, we are going to have plenty of time for an open discussion, but we're going to do all the presentations ahead, give you an opportunity to formulate your questions, so you have your notepads, and all of our presenters are going to come up for that open discussion at the end. Our next presentation is going to be by Jacqueline Kelly Mchale, who's an associate professor and director of the music education program here at DePaul. Her research focuses on culturally responsive teaching in K-12 music classrooms, the role of social justice in music teacher education programs, and composition in K-12 classrooms. She has published articles in the Journal of Research in Music Education and Mountain Lake Reader. She is an active clinician, having presented workshops at state and national conferences. She also serves as a consultant for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's Institute for Learning. She earned her doctorate at Northwestern University, an MA in music education from the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, and her bachelor's in music education from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. She also earned a quarterly mastery certificate and has completed levels in both the Orff and Delacroix approaches to music education. Please welcome Dr. Kelly Mchale.
Give me a second while I figure out how to get to my presentation here. And before I start, I do have to say every picture in my presentation, we did have permission from the schools and the students in all the pictures. So just want to put that out there. Assessment is a broad topic, and I've decided to approach it in terms of the overall scope of the program that I direct here. I'm the music education professor, and I oversee the development of future music educators in the area of K-12 education. Today I'm going to talk about the spiral that begins in the Introduction to Music Education program and culminates with Illinois licensure and a Bachelor of Music in Music Education degree. As we all know, our students grow, well, that's not supposed to go like that. Yes. Didn't do that when I checked it there. All right, this is, oh, it's after one. It was supposed to shift every 20 seconds, but I'll do it on mouse click and we'll just pretend that it's shifting after every 20 seconds. Let me go back to it. I'm a Mac user, I'm sorry. All right. As we all know, our students grow while they're here. My students, oh. Yes. What am I doing here? Oh, I'm in the wrong place. Okay. Yes, I do. Thank you. So much for being a master teacher, huh? Right. My students enter with visions of either being musician educators, educator musicians, or performers, and sometimes they think about teaching as being a fallback. So it's really important that I structure what I am doing with them in a way that helps them to get to the place where they ultimately want to be. So I begin with, how do I primarily assess, is beginning with, thank you, beginning with goals and objectives and moving into formative and summative assessments throughout. Each year, these goals and objectives change for each cohort, so to speak, of students, because our students have particular needs and desires that I must take into consideration, and they come from very different places. Actually, they come from very similar places. We're hoping it's very different in the future. So I utilize both the formative and the summative practices throughout all of my classes to not only assess my students, but also to assess myself. This meme, lead and they shall follow, is not the goal. But many of my students come in with a very strong desire to replicate and not to grow or change with regard to teaching. So therefore, my assessments must provide them with the tools to be critical and to self-assess. So what research has shown us in music education is that our students enter the degree program with the desire to be exactly like, or very close to being like, their high school band, orchestra, or choir director. So I have to begin with dispositions. What I need my students to recognize is that they are becoming educators and not directors. Directors take their place at the podium and dictate knowledge and process. Educators work to create balance and collaboration within the context. These dispositions become the building blocks that help them eventually to be successful and to thrive. And while the dispositions are like a tree, content, lesson planning, and teaching are like bridges from Pittsburgh. They help students walk from the side of the river where they lived as students over to the side where they become teachers. But the beautiful thing about a bridge metaphor is that you can continue going back and forth. And what we know is that successful teachers are lifelong learners, continually crossing those bridges. So with regard to content, I'm focused primarily on readings that they must do that cover pedagogy, scaffolding of instruction, culturally responsive principles, social justice implications. I wonder if they do the readings. I have to assess that, we all do. Do they understand the readings? And do they understand the different principles and practices that are discussed in each of the readings? To do this, I use Think, Pair, Share a lot. I think kids start doing it in kindergarten, so they're pretty adept at that by the time they get to me. Asking students, what were the important takeaways in the reading before we even start our discussion in class? Or specific questions like, for example, how would you define democracy in music education? Or what are the basics of teaching a song to a 5-year-old? After, another technique I use is outlining the primary emphasis in a reading. I usually do this in small groups. For example, this is one thing I did, draw what you read. I had the students read a chapter on teacher identity that talked about metaphors. We brainstormed metaphors as a class, and then they got into small groups, and they were tasked with large paper and markers and crayons. I have a lot of those in my classroom, to create visual representations of the metaphors that they had decided to embrace at that moment. Another quick assessment tool that I use is a mini task. It takes 5 minutes For example, the students read about how to properly teach a song to an elementary grade classroom. Each student came into class, they had a song on their chair. If they did the reading, they probably knew what was happening next. They got into small groups, they chose which song they wanted to do, and then they had to come up with a plan for how they would teach that song to a group of students. That's at a more introductory level. As they get up to higher level methods classes, that transforms itself and they actually peer teach that. But it's a quick one. They have 5 minutes to decide how they're going to peer teach it, divide it up, and go and do it. And lesson planning is the next big piece of assessment in the program, and it spirals through, starting very, very basic and moving up to very full complex lesson plans. My students write very detailed lesson plans. I know that they will never write a detailed lesson plan like that again once they're in K-12 education, but if they know how to do it now, they'll know how to do it later. I sequence what they get in the plan. They start their first year with just a couple little points like you see on this example. This is just a little snapshot of that lesson plan, and we move forward from there into the full lesson plan. And then the next big piece of what I do is teaching. Peer teaching is where we start. I want to know, do they know the lesson that they've written? Do they know the musical material being taught? Can they clearly deliver instruction? All of this I see. It's formative. I'm watching. But there are other things I do as well with this. We start with peer teaching, we move into practicum teaching, and then we go into actual student teaching. However, the biggest assessment that I do with my students is somewhat recursive in nature, but then it's also carefully scaffolded. It's recursive because it takes place in every class throughout the program, and it's scaffolded because it grows upon itself and becomes more complex as the students move forward, focusing on content, lesson planning, and teaching. So the goal of the goal of the whole package deal, so to speak, is to help students become reflective practitioners, to develop a skill set necessary to move beyond replication and into creative and critical practice, no matter what their teaching context. Students are guided through this process of observing, commenting, group assessment through discussion, self-assessment, and teacher assessment. So that all happens within this whole area. Foundational to this process is the act of teaching for the students. Therefore, we begin with observations of practicing teachers, both via video and in person. We move to peer teaching and then progress through the program into our various practicum placements in the city. The teaching component culminates with our final exam, which is student teaching. One of the primary tools that I use in this is a series of guides and rubrics. Here's one example that focus on various perspectives. We begin with observation guides that are used as a tool to help the students develop the language that will be necessary for them to understand the expectations of teaching and of the teaching and learning process. The rubrics are used by myself and by the students in a self-assessment manner. The other important tool that is employed for this is an iPad. We have a set of iPads that the music education department uses. During the winter of the junior year, each student is given an iPad to use to record their teaching experiences in the practicum site and in their fall student teaching placement. They're also expected to keep all of their lesson plans and self-assessments on the iPad. In the practicum setting, students teach one 30-minute lesson a week for the entire academic year. They become the DePaul music teacher for the classroom. They are responsible for planning, submitting all plans 3 days before they teach for my review, and then submitting final plans after they have reviewed my feedback. 3 times a quarter, they are expected to review a full 30-minute teaching experience from their classroom and fill out their self-assessment forms. We then conference during finals. This serves as our final. We conference during finals to review their progress. During student teaching, the students continue to use the iPad and are expected to continue to plan. However, we recognize that there's a shift as they find themselves working side by side with a veteran teacher. Each student is required to present one short clip of their teaching to their fellow student teachers during our weekly seminar, where we discuss, offer feedback, and they also continue to do self-assessment. However, our students are also now required to do a Pearson administrated assessment in order to be licensed in Illinois. Everything we've done leading up to student teaching does help to support them in that process as well. So this is the end goal. After 4 years of careful scaffolding and recursive practice and attention to dispositions, the final result is hopefully a group of music educators who are prepared to enter classrooms and become transformative teachers instead of mirror images of the teachers who have come before them. Thank you.
Our next presentation is by Michele McCay. Dr. McCay has a strong history of public health leadership and service. She earned her Master of Public Health in Maternal and Child Health from the University of Illinois at Chicago School of Public Health, and returned to earn a Doctor of Public Health in Leadership, with a focus on maternal and child health leadership and management. She has worked with public health initiatives that focus on diverse issues that affect women, children, and families, including chronic disease in children, affordable health care for working families, smoking prevention, and perinatal mental health issues, children's mental health care as well. Continuing in her leadership roles in public health and maternal and child health, Dr. McCay served as the executive director of Chicago Volunteer Doulas, Incorporated. Although no longer actively providing doula support, she remains committed to studying and promoting natural birthing techniques and breastfeeding in communities of color. Here at DePaul, she is a teaching assistant professor in the Department of Health Sciences, where she teaches public health, health research literacy, health leadership, and maternal and child health. She also serves as a faculty advisor to 2 student groups on campus and mentors several college-aged women of color. Addressing global maternal and child health and public health issues is growing interest, and she has recently completed work in Ghana, the Ivory Coast, and Angola. In June, she will travel to Kenya and Uganda for a community health project. She lives in Bronzeville with her husband, the Reverend Cedric McCay, and they enjoy taking advantage of Chicago's food and cultural activities when they're not traveling and working around the world. Please welcome Dr. McCay.
Thank you. I was impressed by that one. That was nice. Okay, let me just do this. Okay, so it was an absolute pleasure to be with you all today and share my path towards authentic assessment. I have to tell you, I really didn't realize that that was what I was doing until more recently, but it is a part of the work that I really enjoy engaging with my students upon. So my path and my journey actually started with all of the questions that I would receive from my students. Things like, what can I do with this degree? Where should I go to graduate school? Am I going to ever use any of the things that we're learning in the classroom? Of course I said, yes, we'll use them, and here I'll show you how. So my first goal was to help them learn how to translate. Let's see, it's not moving. Oh, sorry. So to be a bridge between their undergraduate experience and their postgraduate experience, whether that means they're going to be early career professionals or if it means they're going to go on to graduate school. I felt like my responsibility was kind of to marry those 2 experiences for them. So I asked them to translate high-level, complex health information into more relatable layperson language. This is something they're going to have to do all of the time, whether they become clinicians or if they become healthcare leaders and administrators. This is an example. This is from Essence magazine, which caters to African American women. So I asked my students to think more critically about what they see in terms of health messaging. So when you see this in Essence magazine and you compare it to what you know now about cancer mortality rates in African American communities, why should you be concerned about an ad like this? So I also have them experience the joy and the pain of Journal Club, something you all have experienced in your own academic experiences and work experience. They too will have the opportunity to experience that together, helping each other understand difficult scholarly journals. They also have the opportunity to develop surveys and to implement surveys and use the data that they've collected to help understand how we can create programs, services, and policies to influence and impact the communities that they're trying to serve. I hope to be a connection for them between not only the models and the methods and the concepts we learn in the classroom, but the experiences that they're going to have when they leave our safe space. So one of the ways I do that is I make them leave Lincoln Park. For heaven's sakes, who would think? So they have to go out and they have to explore other communities to see what some of the deficits are, but also some of the assets in terms of public health and social entities. They also have to prepare proposals. So this is something we all do. We have to write grants. We have to address scenarios that happen. They even practice responding to a fictitious boss about a scenario going on in a workplace, helping them prepare in a mentored and guided way. They also get to practice an experience like this, working and participating in a conference. So they dress in business casual, they put on a poster session, they have to fight for space in that room, they have to field questions that aren't really questions, they're really comments from their peers. They get to experience exactly what we do here. I also ask them to use all of the energy and youth that they have to be advocates, right? So I tell them, fight the power. Be advocates in your personal lives, but also be advocates in your workplace. There's no reason that should end when you leave DePaul. I ask them to take a ride with me, sometimes literally and figuratively. We visit different places around the city that could be possible locations for internships and for jobs after they graduate. And they're always thrilled to see what this really looks like when we operationalize the work we do in the classroom. And then finally, I ask them to be globally focused, right? Have a perspective that is outside of our very American-based perspective in what we read and what we teach. And so we ask them, one, to think outside of themselves and think about how they impact and influence what's going on in the world and vice versa. And then finally, I'll leave you with these smiles. Hopefully it represents not only the joy that hopefully my students get from engaging in a creative way, but quite honestly, the joy I get from participating in all of these activities with them. Thank you.
Our last presentation for the session will be from Dr. Michele Morano. Her essays have appeared in journals and anthologies such as Best American Essays, the Georgia Review and Missouri Review, Ninth Letter, and the fourth genre, Contemporary Writers of Creative Nonfiction. Honors and awards for her writing have come from the Rona Jaffe Foundation, the McDowell Colony, the American Association of University Women, the Magazine Association of the Southeast, the Crab Orchard Review, and the Illinois Arts Council, among others. She's not just a master teacher, she's a master writer. Dr. Morano holds a PhD in English and a Master of Fine Arts in Nonfiction Writing from the University of Iowa. She is obviously here in Chicago, where she's an associate professor of English at DePaul and directing the Masters in Writing and Publishing program here. Please welcome Dr. Morano.
Okay. End of slideshow. Okay. Okay, there we go. All right, so the courses I teach are primarily creative writing workshops that utilize a pedagogy whereby students sit around a seminar table talking about each other's works in progress, identifying things that are working well, things that could work better, and also some of the paths toward revision. This is skills-based teaching. There is not really a body of knowledge that I can test students on, or rather, if I were to do that, it wouldn't do anything to capture the learning and the increased skills that they're gaining. So sometimes grading can feel pretty counterproductive in courses like this for a couple of reasons. One, grading inserts a kind of judgment into the middle of the artistic process that can be sort of fatal. And two, I can't always tell from early drafts how well they're going to progress toward a finished project. For example, I sometimes will get an essay that is a pretty solid essay. You know, it's technically well carried out. There's a good narrative arc. There's a lot of interesting sentence level stuff going on. But the overall story is kind of dull. And it's sort of a B+ idea. You know, the essay has already fulfilled its own mediocre potential and probably isn't going to get a lot better. On the other hand, I sometimes get a piece that is just a holy mess. You know, fragmented scenes and confusion on every page, but fire underneath that, you know? And so I can see real potential for a possible A here. Do I know that the student can take it there? No, and I can't grade on that potential. I have to grade on what's on the page before me. So in my perfect world, we wouldn't be doing this kind of grading, right? Every creative writing course would be taken pass-fail. We would bracket the element of evaluation, and we would embrace the artistic process and maybe sing a little kumbaya. But also in my perfect world, I would be taking a lot of naps every day. You know, I would be behaving much more and living much more the way my new kittens do, napping constantly. But that isn't the world in which we live, and I do have to grade along the way because students need markers of evaluation. They get twitchy if they don't have that. They want some sense of how I'm seeing their work. So the whole process of grading along the way is complicated a little bit by the specific kinds of courses I teach. Courses in creative nonfiction, travel writing, memoir writing, writing the personal essay, in which students are drawing from their own personal experiences. So I'm sure you can imagine a travel essay that's talking about a family trip in which family members didn't necessarily behave so well. Maybe the author also didn't necessarily behave so well. And the act of grading can feel to a student like it's an act of judging, not what's on the page, but actually what's happened in their lives and the choices that they've made. Another complication in the whole grading process in creative writing courses is that workshops invariably offer contradictory feedback. Some students think something really works well, other students think it doesn't work at all. And anyway, in the end, the revision's probably going to cut that whole passage. So there are a lot of moving parts that are going on that complicate the grading. So how do I balance the need for giving feedback along the way and evaluative feedback, letter grades, so that students understand that process, with the desire to capture their learning as they're progressing through the development of skills? Well, one way is that I really do emphasize the process, as most writing teachers do, and we begin with a highly technical stage and term called shitty first drafts. Right? These a term coined by Anne Lamott, but these actually appear on my syllabus, like your shitty first draft is due on this day. I'm not going to read it. There's no evaluation going on, but students are going to share with each other and talk about the next stages in the process. It's in a way to get them over the initial performance anxiety. And then after they go through the shitty first drafting stage, they revise those pieces for workshop and for turning in to me for grading. And then at the end of the term, they have an opportunity to revise further so that they're utilizing the feedback. Around this process of multi-staged sequenced writing, I create a series of low-stakes, informal, ungraded assignments. In a typical course, students will produce 5 of those, along with 2 formal graded assignments, and then a final revision that carries the most weight out of everything they produce at the end. So my goal here is to capture the learning and also to make room for experimentation, for making messes, and for reaching a little farther than what they can actually achieve, and failing, and then trying again and failing a little bit more. And so that's the way we inch towards success, I think. So one example of an informal writing assignment, I often give this early in the term. I ask students to write their autobiography, whole life story, due in 2 days, and don't spend more than 30 minutes on it. So the first response is, it can't be done, and she's crazy, and this is impossible. And then they go and do it. And they start to realize that, well, anything is possible depending on the kinds of choices that you make. But importantly, there's no downside to doing this assignment. They have to complete all the informal writings, but they don't have to do a good job on them. They can dash them off if they're in a hurry. And it gives me a chance to do some individualized teaching on the page when I give feedback without the threat of a grade. So in addition to these low stakes assignments, I also give feedback on the written workshop comments that they offer to each other. This is really important because perhaps the greatest skill I teach them is to be better readers of their own work, to read for potential and possibility and not just for what's wrong with it. Writers tend to be pretty masochistic people. We are very aware of our own shortcomings and will proclaim them from the, to the skies. And so I have to retrain them to be thinking to look not just for what's wrong, but for what could potentially be really right in the next iteration. And then the final ungraded assignment I give accompanies their last revision, and it's a reflective essay in which they tell me about what they were trying to do but haven't yet been able to accomplish, so that the course ends on the idea of this still being a process that they're in the middle of. And I can give them credit for the thinking they've done, even when they haven't yet been able to execute it on the page. Thanks.
Hello? Oh, there we go. We're going to open it up to questions that you have for our panelists. They're each going to take a seat up on the stage. I have a microphone. Does anybody have any questions for any of our presenters? Hold on a second.
Emily, you were talking about group exercises, but then you give individual feedback. How does that work?
I meant feedback on each group exercise.
Oh, on each group. Okay, right. Sorry.
This is how I'm getting my steps in today.
My question is for Professor Kelly Mchale. Since we were listening to Tom Angelo talking about values and where students are coming from, I was really fascinated by the comment that you made that the future teachers came into this with this image of, I mean, obviously a teacher who really impressed them, and that's why they wanted to go into it. So what do you do to kind of unpack what they valued in that in order to move on to the tree of I forgot what you called them, the different areas that you want them to focus on?
Thank you. It's a great question. It starts in the introduction to music education class, and I have to be really careful that I am not painting a picture of their heroes in a negative way. So I really start with them talking about why they want to be music teachers, identifying their favorite teachers, and then starting to talk about why they were their favorite teachers. And so we start having those conversations that then shift a couple weeks later into conversations about what does quality teaching look like. And those conversations aren't tied to their memories. So what does quality teaching look like from a different perspective, and then, or from other perspectives, and then bringing it back into music education. And then we start talking about statistics. And we talk about, look around the classroom. 85% of all teachers are white. 95%, 98%, 99% of all the students in my classroom they look the same. They come from very similar backgrounds. So we can start using those kinds, and many other statistics too. So basically demographic statistics, so to really look at what is going on, why is it going on? Now let's think about what else could we be doing? How can these things shift and change? So I try to bring a social justice perspective into it as they're starting to think about where their teaching identity is going to go. And I usually spend about the first 5 or 6 weeks feeling like I'm walking on eggshells a lot. And then as we progress, I feel things kind of opening up. I have them do a big portfolio assignment where they do a portfolio in Digication, and they have to answer specific questions, and I really get to know who they are as people, and I give them very detailed feedback that really, I'm not critiquing their writing, I'm commenting on their experiences, and I'm sharing my experiences too. And that always, as soon as I give that feedback, as soon as they get those papers from me, I feel things starting to open up and them starting to become more willing to examine different possibilities. So, thank you.
I don't know if you need
You can always.
Okay. This is also for Professor Cauble. You mentioned 5 different options, and you work with a fairly large class, 80 students. Which one do you think options tends to work the best with a large group? Is there one that works best with a large group? Or does it?
I usually use all of them at different points in time throughout the semester.
Really?
you know, I try to have them turn in at least one individual exercise before, other than the final exam. You know, I'll use multiple choice questions to test certain topics, but there are different topics that lend themselves better to different methods, as we all kind of know. So, you know, I mean, I think ideally the individual exercises are the best, but it's not in terms of the feedback, but it's, I think there are also upsides to them doing group exercises because they can learn from each other and learn by teaching each other. And so I try to kind of do a mixture of things because I think different methods work better for different topics and for different students.
Sounds practice.
It is, but I think I think kind of touching on a little bit of one of the themes from the presentation this morning, some of it, it lets you take some of the teaching outside of the classroom so that you have time to get through more stuff during class, too.
Hi, I'd just like to follow up on the idea of self-limitations that you just raised, Dr. Morano, but this question really is for anybody who might have some particularly helpful ideas for helping those students who have really good ideas but don't have a lot of confidence, so don't necessarily want to speak up. And you know, a lot of you talked about doing peer-to-peer interactions, which are really helpful. It kind of forces them to do that, but not everything is in that format. So just want to see if you have anything that was particularly effective.
Well, I mean, I think you're, is that on? I think you're talking about like in class. Are you thinking about like speaking up in the classroom? So I think a mixture of small group, you know, conversations and large group conversations can be really helpful. But I also think that, you know, I do teach a class in which I use flipped pedagogy. So the stuff that usually happens in the classroom all gets migrated online. So all of the class discussions happen in an online forum. And in class, we're doing writing labs. So we're doing the kind of writing, brainstorming, and all that kind of stuff in class. Initially, when I started this, I felt kind of bad, like, well, surely they need me more at the center of leading the discussions, you know? And the discussions online aren't as good, I think, and robust as they were in the classroom, but the writing really improves in those classes. And what happens in the online discussions is that I see people who never speak in class really go into town, and I get a totally different perspective on who they are and how they're processing their learning. So I think even in a regular class, if to the extent that you can incorporate in-class writing exercises that allow people to gather their ideas and get to a place where they feel more confident. I've actually even spoken to students who are particularly introverted and said, I don't want to penalize you, but we do have a participation component to the grade. So if you just give me some notes about what you were thinking about during a class discussion, I can register what's going on. You know, but I think in that way you can make them slowly more comfortable sharing their thoughts.
Hi, Michele. And hi. And for you, and for anyone else who uses peer feedback in your teaching, I'm curious about how you kind of negotiate and helping the students place value on peer feedback and not just say, yeah, I'll buy the time until I get the feedback that really matters, the feedback from the instructor, because it sounds like, and I know that you're very successful in getting people to really listen to each other in the classroom. So how do you do that? How do you not make your feedback seem like the thing to trump everyone else's feedback?
Well, I mean, one thing I do is that, you know, I'm very prescriptive about the peer review sessions, so I give them a list of questions that I want them to go through. And then each person has to fill out at the end of a peer review session their own list of like 4 things that they're gonna do. And it's a little bit like piggybacking off the presentation this morning. So how are they gonna implement? And it can't be like, I'm gonna revise the introduction. Like, that's too broad. If that's your chore, you're gonna go clean the bathroom instead. So I want them to be really specific about, I'm going to move the line from page 2, paragraph 3, into the opening and finesse that. Like that's a one, specific thing they can do. So I think that if they have goals like that they're working toward, they're more likely to see it as productive. And also before we start a peer review session, I always brainstorm with them about what has worked in the past, what hasn't worked, and they always say what doesn't work is when everyone says, oh, this is great. It's not very useful. And so they kind of hold each other a little bit more accountable, but I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying it always works, as well as I'd like.
In my situation, students are offering feedback to students who are getting up and trying to teach them. So sometimes they're acting like third graders and being taught by their peer. And so in preparation for that, we do a lot of observations. We use a lot of video for observations, and we really practice how do we look at teaching and how do we give the right feedback, and how do we express ourselves. So I will let the students, I will model it for the students, and then as it gets to the point where when they're doing their peer teaching that is graded, I always have the students give their feedback first. And a lot of times I'll piggyback right on top of something that a student said, so then it doesn't become teacher feedback, peer feedback, as much as it just becomes group feedback. And we just kind of, I jump off of this point and then bring someone else's point from a previous peer teaching in and things like that, so that we can have conversations. And we can also create a safe environment for the students, because they are putting themselves out there. When you have a tuba player who doesn't want to sing and who has to use his falsetto, a male tuba player who's really a bass baritone when he sings, and now because you're teaching small children, he has to sing in falsetto and he has to do this in front of his peers, some of which there might be other extenuating circumstances that I'm not aware of. They're really putting themselves out there. So we have to really try to make it as comfortable as we can, but also challenging and really helping them to grow and to understand what the outcome's going to be.
Actually, I do have a question on, you're talking about how receiving feedback can be incredibly personal, and I think that's true for all of you. So I wish if Emily and Michele, if you could also share how you help soften your students to be more receptive to feedback that might be otherwise difficult to accept or to listen to.
I think I'd like to start by just encouraging them to use words that are supportive and productive instead of, I guess, critical and harmful. And that way they have this expectation that the feedback that they're going to get is not to tear them down, but to really provide some guidance for improvement.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's it's taken me a long time to get comfortable with the art form of delivering criticism in a way that is positive, and not positive for the sake of patting someone on the head, but for the sake of enabling them to get excited about moving forward, right? Like that's really genuinely, okay, this is not working at all, but look at this really cool thing that's happening in here. So I think being honest, first of all, but also always having in mind that there's another set of steps in this process and really amazing things can happen.
Dr. Morano, you talked about low stakes assessments and that you don't grade so that they are motivated to write without that in mind. But what is the motivation for students to do that kind of assessment if they're not going to get a grade? What do you tell them?
They have to do it in order to pass the course, so they have to turn in everything. But I tell them that this is these informal writings are the place where you can blow things off. So when you're in a crunch time in the term, this is a release valve. You can just bang this out in 15 minutes and there's no penalty as long as you turn it in. You're missing the opportunity to get feedback that might help you develop your next formal assignment, but that's totally up to you. But what you can't blow off are the peer reviews and the workshops, because other people are depending on it. And you really can't blow off the sort of steps in the writing process. So I think it helps them to feel like they have permission to make adjustments in their own lives. The truth is, on that 30-minute autobiography, everybody cheats. Everybody cheats. They confess it afterwards. They spend more than 30 minutes because they're excited about it. you know? And so that's like a little psychological trick too in the beginning to tell them, oh, you don't really have to do, and then they really want to. You know, so I think sometimes they work better because of that, because of the lowered pressure.
Time for just a few more questions.
This question is for Dr. McCay. The field of public health is so applicable, real world, and so I love that you have your students get out of Lincoln Park and really apply what they're learning in the classroom to field experiences. How do you assess those learning, teachable experiences?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Molina. So the way that I do that is really kind of thinking and listening to what they ask of the host at the university or the clinic or the agency. So if it's just a question about the building, or is it a question about the work that they do? And if they ask questions that are related to the reading. So it's really kind of listening to the questions that they ask and the discussion afterwards. So we will also host a discussion, and that gives me a better idea of if they're just present and happy to be outside of, you know, the classroom, or if they're really kind of engaging and connecting with the readings and kind of this new place we're visiting.
I have a question. Just, we're hearing about where you are now, and I wondered if any of you had a touchstone moment that may have caused your assessment practices to change, or anything that you can reveal about your process for those of us who are kind of still on our trajectory to figure out what we need to fix. Thanks.
I'll actually start and say I didn't know that I would ever teach. I had never even been a TA when I first started teaching day one. So I think I don't have a traditional background and never expected to be doing this work, so I just kind of do what I think makes sense. And so it's worked out so far. So I have to say I look back and I'm surprised at some of the things that work and some of the things that don't. And I just kind of keep going, and I'm not hindered by, I guess, some philosophy necessarily that makes me feel guilty about whether I'm doing it or not. So I've opened myself to being creative and making sure that my students are really getting the take-home messages, less than I am worried about if they've connected to a philosophy that I've been married to for many years.
I had a student have a complete emotional breakdown after teaching a kindergarten class in the school where we did practicum a number of years ago. And at the time, I was the only person I still am the only person supervising it. And so I have anywhere from 8 to 10 classes running at a time over an hour-long period. So I'm bouncing from class to class and just going in and watching a little bit here and there. And I didn't get to that class that day. And the student was, I'm never going to be a teacher, and I knew that the student could be a teacher. I knew that there were extenuating circumstances in the classroom and that it wasn't necessarily all on the student's back. And I need to have eyes in every room while the students are working. And that really made me start looking into different ways that we could use technology to better serve, so that if I don't have the chance to come in and intercede and help, I can still sit down and go through the recording and say, okay, do you see what happened here? This was escalating in the corner and you weren't aware of it. And so that was one of those moments where you never like to have a student sobbing hysterically and then also adding, I want to quit the program. Like, no, you are going to be a good, and she is a wonderful teacher now, and she's doing a great job in the field, so it worked out. But
I feel like I'm still in the process of learning things and evolving, but I would say that in terms of assessment, the law school model, it's more typical to just have one final exam at the end of the semester and that's it. And one of the things that kind of motivated me to get away from that and start doing assessments during the term was I felt like the range of student abilities has continued to widen, and that makes it challenging to keep the students who pick up on things more quickly interested without losing people who pick up on things less quickly. And I felt like doing assessments was one way to balance that a little bit more, because you could, for the students who were struggling, you could identify who they were and give them additional guidance outside of the classroom and have them, redo assignments, things that covered kind of the basic stuff that you didn't want to slow down the pace of the rest of the class for.
For me, I think early on, I didn't realize the extent to which I was going to have to consider psychology in teaching the courses I teach, you know, not just because of the subjects that come up, but because writing for some reason really plugs into this deep-seated sense of guilt and inferiority that a lot of people have. And so invariably, in every writing workshop, in the beginning, the first couple of weeks of class, before the first major assignment is due, I now finally have the ability to recognize who in the class is not going to show up for a week and a half, is going to kind of go into some sort of hiding mode because they're nervous about putting their work forward. I still don't always catch it in time, but I know that it's going to happen, and I can sometimes let someone know that I think it's going to happen or that I see it happening. And so I've just had to really start thinking a lot more about helping people become comfortable with writing, you know, with what it means and with the deep, I mean, we all do it from the time we're in first grade. And so it feels like something that we ought to be able to do effortlessly, but it isn't. And there's a lot of psychological resistance to it. So it took a long time to sort of recognize that, oh, actually part of my role here is to help them manage that. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Thank you to the panelists. It's actually now time for lunch, so I'm sure you'll find our panelists at lunch if you have any further questions.